Hello. Hi, good evening. Thank you so much for welcoming the feedback. I like the feedback. So welcome to Saving Bannister, a conversation with Ed Shein. Am I saying that right? Shine. Okay, apologies. Barnaby Evans and Ray Rickman, presented by Stages of Freedom. My name is Kajette Solomon, and I'm the Social Equity and Inclusion Program Specialist here at the RISD Museum. In support of the ongoing Edward Mitchell Bannister community celebrations, we've created a visitor's guide that I hope all of you have to 4 Bannister works on view in the galleries upstairs. We do have more than 4 in the collection, but 4 on view. The museum is open until 8 p.m. tonight, so following this talk, please stop by the visitor services desk to check in, grab a guide if you haven't already, and explore. As we begin, I'd like to offer a land acknowledgement. Rhode Island School of Design is built on what is now called College Hill, part of the ancestral homelands of the Narragansett Indian tribe. Indigenous people from many tribes and nations, near and far, live, study, and work in Providence today. The amplification of Native voices and histories is crucial to rectifying the many violent legacies of colonialism, and we gratefully acknowledge the ongoing critical contributions of Indigenous people across our state, region, and nation. Please join me in welcoming to the podium Rob Dimmick, co-founder and program director of Stages of Freedom.
Good evening. Kajette, thank you so much for your warm welcome. Before we begin, there's a young man who all of you met when you came in that I want to officially introduce you to. This is Cadus Esperanza. He's 9 years old, and he is a force to be reckoned with. Please give him a round of applause. Cadus is emblematic of the work that we do at Stages of Freedom, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But Cadus, thank you so much for being our greeter and an extraordinary human being. Thank you so much. As you know, I'm Rob Dimmick. I'm half of Stages of Freedom along with Ray Rickman, and I welcome you to Saving Bannister. We are so honored to be in this space, which we consider a second home. We have done many programs here at the RISD Museum. And in addressing that, I want to thank Deb Clemens and Kajette Solomon and Maureen O'Brien, whose work to make this event possible is inestimable. Please, a round of applause. For those of you who are not familiar with Stages of Freedom, we are now in our 8th year of operation. We are a mission of 2 purposes. One is first and foremost to teach low-income African-American children in Rhode Island how to swim. Sadly, they drown 5.5 times more often than their counterparts, their white counterparts. And we spent a year studying this issue before even beginning swim empowerment. And to date, we have put close to 2,600 children in swimming lessons across the state, partnering with 9 YMCAs. Our second mission is to elevate and celebrate Rhode Island African American history. Most of you, I'm sure, are aware it is the most extraordinary history in the country. It is unlike any other history elsewhere in the country. And a lot of that is driven by Newport, Rhode Island. So out of the depth of this very disturbing past called slavery come these extraordinary human beings that have invented, created, and created pathways for all of us to follow to this very day. Additionally, I want to thank the Jamestown Historical Society, Michael McGuigan, whose wonderful annotated bibliography of Edward Mitchell Bannister and Christiana Carteau Bannister has recently been published. It is available at our space at Stages of Freedom. All of you in your program have a museum card and also a 20% discount. We hope that you'll come and visit us. The hours are on that card, and everything you purchase in our museum space pays for those swimming lessons I mentioned. I also want to thank Frederick Mattis and Sandra Williams, who made this event possible. Additionally, we have a wonderful team member at Stages of Freedom now with us for 2 years, and that's Alex Gimfain, who is a master of all trades, and we could not do the work that we do without him. Please, a round of applause for Alex. I wanted to show you our most recent acquisition for our museum. This is the 1876 Centennial Guidebook. This is where Edward Bannister won first place for Under the Oaks in 1876. It's a fairly rare item. It has 2 maps in it. One of them is a pull-out map that shows the entire range of the buildings and events that occurred at the Centennial. It is our firm belief, because I have found no other record of a national award for an artist prior to the 1876 exhibition, that Edward Bannister is the first to win a national award. And that is important because this is a man of African descent. I want to recognize the person who's really responsible for coalescing all of what we are now engaged with in the life of both Edward and his extraordinary wife, Christiana Carteau Bannister, and that is the sculpture, really the genesis of this entire project, Gage Prentice. Please welcome. For those of you who have not seen the statue, it sits at Marketplace on the Providence River, and it is a sight to behold. It is incredibly powerful, both visually and historically. And the idea that one can now sit on the bench next to Edward Bannister as he sketches, I'll leave it up to you to discover what he is sketching at that point, is just a remarkable testament to Bannister's life and to Gage Prentice's vision. So again, thank you, Gage, so much. I do ask that if you have any kind of audio device that you please turn it off. We are recording this event. And it is now my pleasure to introduce 2 of our presenters. The third will be introduced by another important gentleman in our midst. The first is the co-founder of Stages of Freedom, Ray Rickman, whose vision it was to create swim empowerment, our former Deputy Secretary of State, and the most important African-American historian that we have here in Providence. Secondly, this event is really about the work of Edward Shein, and it's an extraordinary story, an extraordinary journey that he has taken to assemble in the 70s a quantity of Bannister paintings and secure them in the Smithsonian Museum of Art. And so those are 2 of our important presenters tonight. And to introduce the third, I welcome to the stage Charles Newton, Chair of Waterfire, and then we'll begin. Thank you.
Well, where do I begin? Let me start this way. As I mature, as I get older, I'm now just past 70, I begin to contemplate and think about the journey not taken, or the choice not taken. And as I get older, I think about the influences of individuals that migrated for one reason or another to Rhode Island. One of the individuals I'm supposed to talk about graduated from Brown University in 1975, and he probably could have gone anywhere, but he chose to stay here. And the reason why I believe, in my capacity as chairman of Water Fire, I have the honor and distinction of introducing him is because he is a pillar and a leader within many things of Rhode Island, not just artistically, which he is well renowned for, not just as a historian, which he is, not just as someone who is an innovator in terms of the rising and falling of the sea levels and the rising and lowering of the gate. But more than that, he is someone who has chosen to stay in Rhode Island, to dig roots deep into the community, and to consistently and always give of himself entirely and consistently to bring about change in Rhode Island. And I just wanted to, as I mature, as I get older, oftentimes we don't get an opportunity to say how much we appreciate someone. So I'd like to introduce my friend and my cohort and my co-chair of Water Fire, Barnaby Evans. Thank you very much.
So Charles, you think you're getting older. You're not 223 years old. Would you all join me standing to sing happy birthday to Edward Mitchell Bannister today? Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. My guess is we need to use this. We'll see. So this is supposed to be an extraordinary time. I've known for 30 years. I've studied the Bannisters, not in a formal way, but I've studied them. I've been in love with Mrs. Bannister for 40 years. I was invited by my friend Al Clyburn to go to John Brown and stand in for him and talk about Christiana Cato Bannister. I found out well, I'm going to leave that alone because he's in heaven. So I get there, and I'm nervous. I hadn't been nervous since I was 16 years old about giving a speech to a bunch of people. But I didn't know what I needed to know. And I found out the 82 people in that room knew nothing. Because the scholarship is very thin. And 40 years ago, almost no one had done anything. So I ran around for a whole month and got myself ready and went and gave a talk and fell in love with her. You talk about a person. And behind every great man is a great woman. And in this case, it is as true as it has ever been. Maybe Eleanor Roosevelt and Franklin. But anyway, that's how I got involved. And then later, I chaired a commission because I was a state rep and I found it disgusting that the Rhode Island State House had no image of a woman. None. Absolutely disgusting. Now, I try to be militant every chance I get. And I'm shocked. Now, this is an insult to half the people in this room. I'm insulted by what people let go, that they show up and there's nothing but white men. And they're all going, oh, that's normal, or we'll get to it one day. So I asked the Secretary of State, Ed Inman, if we could put a woman in the State House, and he said, of course, no, because only Speaker of the House and governors can have their images. And I said, no, those are paintings. And so Ed Inman got bold and asked the President of the Senate if we could put an image of a woman, statue, in front of the Senate, because there's an alcove there. And he said, yes. Now, I'm giving this long introduction, not about Edward, but about her, because every chance I get, as I grow older, Charles, I look for militancy in people. We're not going to change the world just going around letting it be the way it is. Now, and we'll get to this with you in a minute, Barnaby, about what Edward Bannister is about. But I'm sharing this with you because this extraordinary woman, you need to visit her at the State House if you haven't. She is stunningly elegant, as she should be. She's right up there with the statue. Smaller, but different and unique. Enough about her. Tell us about you, Ed.
I hope this sounds okay. I come from right around here. I grew up on Camp Street and then Rochambeau Avenue, and then I went to Hope High School, and then I graduated from Brown University. And the reason I'm mentioning that is because all things in your life happen in your subconscious. And, sorry. And when I went to Hope, it was half African American and half white. When I went to Brown, there were 12 African American students there. So I knew there was something wrong. The next 4 years of my life were sort of lost. I went to law school in California for 1 year. It was not for me. And I was not for them either. And then I worked in Boston for 3 years in the stock market. I had no passion for it. I learned that I couldn't be good at anything unless I had my heart in it. My parents, in particular my mother, had collected Providence Art Club artists for years. They lived in a house with a lot of paintings by all the people you know that founded the Providence Art Club. And I used to laugh at those paintings because I thought they were minor leaguers, and life is so ironic. So now it's 1970, I don't know if I'm gonna be able to make a living, I don't know if I'm gonna have a career. And I had a friend who was a man of color who had an antique shop on Broad Street. His name was Al Jennings, and he was a hero in the Korean War. He fought at the Yalu and had bayonet wounds on his neck. He called me up one day and said, I just got a painting, you ought to come over and see it. Sorry, I'm sorry. So I went over to his antique shop on Broad Street, and he had this painting by Edward Bannister of boys fishing. If we could show that. Okay. It had 2 large chairs in it. He didn't know if it could be repaired. I told him it could be. He asked me if I wanted to buy the picture. I did. It hit me over the head. I knew who Bannister was already, not just from my mother, but I remember, I always read the Providence Journal, and I remembered in the 1960s that G. William Miller, who was a famous Rhode Islander, had bought 14 Bannisters, and I think they were exhibited at the Rhode Island School of Design Museum. He ended up giving them to the Smithsonian. Alex, could we show the next image? These are the two best ones. That's called The Approaching Storm on the left, and the other one is called Swale Land, although my soon-to-be close friend David Driscoll, the famous art professor, called it Swaley Land, and I call it Swaley Land in honor of him. But in any event, getting back to boys fishing, I took it to a conservator, and it needed restoration, it needed to be relined, and I realized that I should do more research on Bannister, which I had never done. So I was oblivious to the Athenaeum. I didn't even know it existed. I went to the Providence Public Library. There was an elderly lady who was the librarian there, and she helped me. She helped me for 2 days. She showed me all the things that Ray and Barney know about Bannister that I didn't know at the time, about how he had come from Nova Scotia as a seaman, how he had gone to work cutting hair in Boston for Christiana Babcock Cartreau, because she was Christiana Babcock originally from the Narragansett tribe. She was part African American and part Native American. And he worked for her cutting hair, and then they married, and he became an artist. He took lessons from William Rimmer at the Lowell Institute, as Barney has told me, for free. And by the way, he is one of 4 significant African-American artists in the 19th century. There's only 4. Edmonia Lewis, the famous sculptress from Ohio, she ends up going to Rome. Robert Duncanson, who sold paintings to the King of Sweden and to baronesses in London, he goes to London. Henry O. Tanner, who was Thomas Aiken's pupil, he spends his life in Paris. Edward Bannister doesn't do any of that. He either can't afford to go, and so, but that being said, he has talent. And I could see it in these 2 paintings that Miller had owned, and I could see it in Boys Fishing. So
let me slow you down for a second. We're going to jump in, and so all these great painters, and I agree with you, they're the great African-American painters of that century. They have to go to Europe. This is the most racist society in the history of the world. And it doesn't matter if you're Tanner, it doesn't matter who you are. There's an exception to it. And we'll talk about it in some more detail later. I have a theory. Matter of fact, I'll tell you my theory, and then you both can respond. So for years, I wonder how in Jim Crow, Rhode Island, wretched, racist Rhode Island, where a black person can't even work in a factory, that this man can succeed and exceed and walk around with the Metcalfs and all of that, how he can do it. And one day, after 20 years of thinking about this, I'm standing in front of the First Baptist Church in America, and I look over at the art club, and I say to myself, I get a hold of the metal rail there, and Morgan, I say to myself, I've got the answer. He was not an African American. He was Canadian. And Canada was the opposite. Opened its doors and said after the American Revolution, this country's empty, come on. America's, the British, doesn't want to take them home to England. They're racist too.
right.
And so Canada, which they control, they can dump the black folks there, and the Canadians want them. Now, every chance I get, this is my militancy again, okay? I remind people of how racist this country is and why we have the problems we have. So I was stopping you from going forth with their greatness, which they had to achieve on foreign soils.
Right.
Can I just mention about the Canadian? We often hear, when we dedicated Gage's statue, we had a bunch of talks, and many people referred to Bannister as the first African American or the first black American artist. He was proudly a Canadian. And 6 months before he died, he still on the census declared himself to be an alien, Canadian, Bajan, or from Barbados. And I think we should do him the honor of reflecting that, because it was important to him that he was Canadian. And he certainly could have become a citizen. He had lunch every week with the federal judge, who was a member of the A&E Club. This was a deliberate decision not to become an American, and I think it's telling us something.
I did not know that, any of that. It's interesting. By the way, talking about him being Canadian, once the Civil War started, Edward and Christiana were very involved in the Underground Railroad. They were big abolitionists, and they were big supporters of the Massachusetts 54th. So you all know the story from seeing the movie Glory, which came out in 1989, but I found this out in 1972, that the Union kind of sacrificed the Massachusetts 54th at the Battle of Fort Wagner in 1863. They sent them, it was impossible. It was worse than Pickett's charge at Gettysburg. There was no way they could go across this open field with the cannons, and the Confederates were in these bulwarks, the sharpshooters, they picked them off. And Bannister and Cristiano were so upset. Bannister did a painting of Robert Gould Shaw, the white colonel who was the commander. And that painting, by the way, is also missing. But it showed me at the Providence Public Library that there was a commitment to doing the right thing in life that went way beyond the art. So the lady from the library also let me look at a copy of the memorial catalog at the Providence Art Club in 1901, where they had all Bannister's best paintings and the names of the Providence people that owned them. And a lot of them were already in antique shops. In 1970, 71, there were 25 antique shops in the Rhode Island area, and they all had paintings. It was unbelievable. $20, $10, no one was interested. So I realized that this might be the start of a career, at least for a while, if I could find these paintings. And also, I think I would be doing something good with my life where there was some integrity, which my parents had brought me up to aspire to. But anyway, being honest. So
tell us about the 25 antique shops.
They were all over the place, and they were funky people, and they were antique dealers are very strange people. They don't exist anymore, but in those days they did, and if they have instincts about people. If they sense that you're doing it for the right reasons and you're not, and you're treating them fairly, they're loyal. And a lot of the Bannisters that I ended up finding were because I developed relationships with these people. But so I started finding them. I found 4 or 5 of them, and because the lady had given me, I made a copy of the memorial catalog, and by now I've run out of money, and I don't know what to do. And I know there's more of them out there. So I had 2 friends who were brothers and who were related to me, where there was a tremendous generational relationship. My father had been their father's best friend. My father had been their father's lawyer during the Depression, and they were the Frank brothers, Buddy Frank and Mel Frank, and they were both about 15 years older than me, but they were already my friends, and they liked me. So I called them on the phone, and I met with them, and I told them what I was doing, and I said, I think this is important. And they were both far left about the issue of race. They both agreed with me that this was an inequity, and they agreed to buy some, and they would keep them in their houses. And but one of them, Buddy Frank, who was a visionary, he said to me, you know, at some point you got to find a museum for these paintings. And that was easier said than done, because most of the white museums at that time had no interest in these artists. It was amazing. So I found there was one museum that in Washington called the Museum of African Art, and they owned 4 Henry O. Tanners. So I called the director on the phone. His name was Warren Robbins, and I told him I was finding banisters, and I already had some. And he said, come on down tomorrow. He said, come tomorrow for lunch. I'll buy you a sandwich at noontime. So I got up at 4 in the morning, and I drove to Washington. I got there a little before noontime. And it was not what I expected. First of all, he was the least museum director ever, because he had been in the State Department for his whole career in Germany, and in Germany he had bought 8 African sculptures, which were beautiful. I knew nothing about them. And then he had retired, and he had bought Frederick Douglass's house in Washington. So that was now the Frederick Douglass Museum of African Art. But he did have 4 tanners that were, I thought, were mediocre tanners. They were the later period of Tanner, where after he'd gone to Paris, he became influenced by Vuillard and Bonnard, and he became like the Nabby. That's Hebrew for the prophets. Anyway, so he was very blunt with me. He said, I'd love to have some banisters, but I've got no money. He says, I'm running this museum on a shoestring. He said, but there is a guy you should talk to. He says, I don't know if he'll see you. He's the head of the art department at the University of Maryland, and he knows a lot about Bannister. And he said, here's his phone number. He lives in Hyattsville. He never picks up the phone. You can call him. So this is a bad day at this point. And I called David Driscoll up on the phone, and he answers the phone. And this is like one of the turning points of my life, because I tell him what I'm doing, and he says, come over to Hyattsville. So I went over to Hyattsville, and I spent 3 hours with him. I got home at 4 in the morning. But what came out of it, which was mind-blowing, is he had already been named, and no one knew this. I was one of the first people that he told it to. There was going to be an exhibition in 2 years at the Los Angeles County Museum called 2 Centuries of Black Art in America. And he was going to be the curator. And it was going to go from Tanner, Duncanson, Bannister, Edmoni Lewis, all the way up through Aaron Douglas, Romaray Bearden. And he was already starting, and he didn't have any banisters. So he said, any great banister you can get me, I will put it in. And also he said, why don't you go out to Cincinnati? I don't have any Duncansons. And we had a very frank conversation to him. Even though I was still very young, I asked him the important question. I said, is me being white going to be an issue on this with you? And he said, I don't care if you're green. He said, if you can find these paintings and you can bring them to museums and you can make, and he told me about his history. The most famous black art professor of the 20th century was a man at Howard named James Porter. James Porter had written a book in 1943 called Negro Art in America, where he made the case that black artists belonged in the mainstream. And David was his protege and his pupil. Matter of fact, David told me that when he took courses from Porter, he was the only person in the class at Howard. But Porter treated it like there were 30 people there. And I learned from David subsequently all about the Harlem Renaissance, and I learned who Alain Locke was. I learned about Van der Zee. It opened a whole new window to me about artists that had been overlooked. But I can only do so much. But I went home that night. I remember when I got home, I couldn't fall asleep because I realized if I could find these pictures and he put them in that exhibition, it could make a difference. So I went and told my friends, the Franks, about it. I told some other people that I knew about it, a doctor in Barrington named Richard Frades, Paula and Leonard Granoff, who lived diagonally across the street from my mother. I told them about it, and they ended up buying some paintings. And it worked out. If you ever can find a copy of that book, you'll see that there's about 15 Bannisters in there, and I found 12 of them. And there's about 15 Duncansons in there, and I found 12 of them too. I went all the way out to Cincinnati to get them. great stories. There was a doctor in Cincinnati that owned 3 Dunkinsons, and he said, "Come on out." He said, "I'll sell them to you."
So I hope they hear what you're telling them. America not only neglected but rejected African American artists as deeply and strongly as possible.
Right.
And then he comes along and he gets the right museums to agree to a serious exhibition. This is the first one.
Los Angeles County, Brooklyn Museum, High Museum in Atlanta, and Dallas Art Museum. So 4 of the top 25 take the show.
And they publish the catalog.
And they publish the catalog.
And the catalog is sold and given. I saw the list of the 35 white, you call them white, museums they gave them to and said, "Look, dummies,
Yeah.
pay attention."
And by the way, the reviews were controversial. It depended. There were people like Hilton Kramer that buried it when it came to Brooklyn. But there were other people in other parts of it. I went to 3 of the 4 openings, and this was now my life. And it was very interesting. I mean, the big thing it did is at every museum, when I went to the opening, 50% or 2/3 of the people were African American. And I had a sense that a lot of them had not been in that museum before. And so it was a big deal. It was the start of something. And so I keep going. And then, so now we're into...
Barnaby's going to jump in.
Okay, go ahead. So now David Driscoll and I have trust between us. He trusts me, and I trust him. And he calls me up one day, and he said, "I may have finally found a collector who wants to buy this art and wants to keep it in their house. And it won't have to end up in a museum, and this could make a difference." And he said, "I'm going to give the collector your phone number. I'm not going to tell you who it is, but they will call you." So 3 or 4 days goes by, and you know, this is like the lady that you meet, and she says, "Give me your phone number, and I'll call you back." You know what that means. Anyway, so the phone rings, and it's Bill Cosby. And he says, "Camille and I know all about you from David Driscoll. He's our advisor, and I'd like you to come to my house in Shelburne Falls," which is in Massachusetts. It's right on the Mohawk Trail. And he said, "And I'd like to talk to you about buying paintings from you." So I went there. And I walk into his house, and Camille isn't there in the beginning. He's in his bathrobe. He's got his feet up on his desk. He's smoking a cigar, and he starts to lecture me about Bannister. And he doesn't know anything about it. And this is my life. So, as Deborah will tell you, you can't take me anywhere. I look at him and I say to him, and I had seen him in I Spy. I really liked I Spy. I liked him and Robert Culp. I never got to the Huxtable part. But anyway, so I said to him, "Look, you are a famous American." I said, "I know about you." I said, "I know you were a serious athlete at Temple. You played basketball, you played football, you played track, and I'm nobody." I said, "But this is the one thing in the world that I know a lot about. So don't 4-letter word talk to me about Bannister." And he backed off. And it was the start of me selling them over 4 or 5 years, some very significant paintings. And even though he and I, and I'm not saying this because of the history, it's just the facts, I never liked him, and I don't think he ever liked me. But it was like, but can I tell one story? All right. So the hardest artist to find of the 4 great black artists was Edmonia Lewis. She had gone to Oberlin, and she had gotten thrown out of Oberlin because she thought it was racist, and she put Spanish fly in the drinks of the faculty at a cocktail party, and she got kicked out. And she ended up going over to Rome, and that's where a lot of her sculptures were. It was very hard to find them, and she did some real interesting subject matter, like the old Indian, the Indian arrow maker and his daughter, Hiawatha. Some of the subjects were right out of, you know, the American culture. So I found the Indian arrow maker and his daughter, and I told Driscoll about it, and Driscoll said, sell it to Cosby. So I brought it to Cosby's house, and he and Camille looked at it. And by the way, Camille was the one who really liked the art and really collected it, and she was the brains. So they bought the piece from me. And he calls me back a week later, and he says, I don't like this piece. He says, I want you to take it back. And he says, you don't have to give me my money back. He says, because I know you need the money. He said, but, he says, the next time you get a Duncanson, you call me. He said, is that fair? And I said, sure. So I went and got the Indian arrow maker back. I ended up getting it to the Museum of African Art in Washington in their permanent collection. A year later, they do an exhibition of their collection. It's written up in the Washington Post, and the piece they photograph is the Indian arrow maker and his daughter. So naturally, I sent it to Cosby in the mail. And he calls me up and he says, don't you ever do that to me again. He said, I got the message. So now our relationship, which as I said, we're not close friends, but we need each other. He calls me up one day and he says, I've got a great idea. And I said, what's that? And he said, I want you to come out with a Bannister, Duncanson, and Tanner, and I want you to be my guest on The Tonight Show. I'm going to be replacing Johnny Carson on March 6th. He said, put that down. This is in January. He says, March 6th, 1978. So it's up to you to get a Bannister, Duncanson, and Tanner. Bring them out to, and I said to him, I don't fly. And he said, I don't care. He said, NBC will pay the train fare. So I arranged, and by the way, the tanner that the Rhode Island School of Design owns, which is called the Wailing Wall, which is a fabulous tanner, which is the grand off spot for me. That's the tanner that I had on The Tonight Show. So my close friend, the late Billy Reynolds, the sports writer for the Providence Journal, he came with me. We took the train out to California. I was on The Tonight Show at 3 minutes of 1. And it was, I was so scared. And I've played in tennis tournaments for a lot of my life, as Norma Taylor will attest to. But this was much worse than playing in any tennis tournament. I mean, I almost went out the side door 10 minutes before. I was ready to leave. I thought I'm going to embarrass myself. But people that like me said I didn't. Anyway, so then Cosby says to Reynolds and me, he says, you go back to your hotel room, he says, and I'll get in touch with you. He says, because I've got other plans for you. So we go back to the hotel room, and 24 hours goes by and we never hear from him. So we both agreed, you know, we're done. And we got on the train and went home. And but Bannister, I did have the newspaper boy on The Tonight Show, and just to talk about, when this came on, I heard Ed McMahon muttering in the background, I wonder how many of these Cosby owns. I mean, it was just...
So could I offer everyone on Stages of Freedom's website, you may see the interview. And it is delightful. And Ed is young and handsome. He may not be young, but he's still handsome. But on this show, it is...
Tell the truth, Ray, come on.
It is fabulous on Stages of Freedom's website. Please take a look at it.
Well, the big thing that I said, which I said from my heart, I made the analogy to baseball, where, you know, until Jackie Robinson, black people couldn't play in the major leagues. And there were the Negro leagues, where there were players like Josh Gibson and Satchel Paige, and they would play exhibition games against the white players in Cuba in the off season. And it's been documented that the black players were better and beat the white players. Now, I'm not saying that's the case here with the art. I'm not going there. But the point is, there was something that needed to be corrected. So, by the way, there's one person I want to just have him stand up and introduce you to. When all this was happening, and the Museum of African Art, which got taken over by the Smithsonian, they ended up with 120 banisters, most of which came from me. And I had an art handler who was a friend of mine that packed the paintings for me carefully, because I was sloppy and he was careful. And also, he was willing to drive them from here to Washington. And I hadn't seen him until tonight in 40 years. So George Wall, could you stand up? Yeah. Well, we can tell him the Harriet Tubman story another time. but thank you, George. Of the banisters I had, the three best ones were the Newspaper Boy, the Palmer River, and the Hay Gatherers. And I got out of Bannister around 1980. They had dried up. I wanted to be involved in other art. There was a very good dealer in Newport, Rhode Island named Roger King, who ended up handling banisters and selling them to people like Ed Bradley of 60 Minutes and Ed Holland. Those of you that know music, Ed Holland, Holland Dozier and Holland, they wrote all the lyrics for Motown. Like, you know, the Supremes, Where Did Love Go? Where Did My Love Go? That's Ed Holland. He owned 3 banisters. He's passed away, I believe, right? Yeah. And
let's stop you for a second. Palmer River. Incredible story, incredible painting. Some people think the best.
Of the Barbizon paintings, of the non-figurative paintings.
Yes. So
it was owned by a man who lived off Benefit Street by the name of Darby Ott, who would never sell me the painting. This went on for 10 years. He says, I'm not letting that painting get into some black museum. That's what he said to me. So then he called me up one day in 1981, and I could tell in his voice that he was in the 9th inning, and he said, did I want to come over and buy the painting? And I went over, and I sold it the next day to a collector in Rhode Island named Daniel Meshnig, who was a friend of my mother's, who collected Providence Art Club artists. And he owned the painting for a long time, and to make a long story short, about 3 years ago, the National Gallery bought the painting for, at the time, a record price. I'm not going to talk money. And
you know what? Everybody knows what the sum is. Go ahead.
No, he's not here.
No,
He got the date wrong, so he took a plane to Florida today. Anyway, so the other great painting.
Wait, but I'm going to stop.
Okay.
Because we need this in the video.
Okay.
So, Mr. Bannister is worth nothing because people decide they won't pay. He's in the hundreds. And then he gets in the thousands because of you.
Right.
And then he gets higher because of, and I won't give the credit to everybody, but to people like Cosby and Oprah, and he gets up there. And this is important when a black artist can't make a living no matter how good he is, because nobody will pay $500 for his work. And so this is an extraordinary deed on your part to get him out of the hundreds and to get him in the national museums and to get museums that don't care to care because Oprah says so and Cosby says so. That they're curators. Let me tell you, I've been involved in this not as long as you, but since the 80s, Rob and I, and the curators won't buy it. The curators get the museum not to accept these black artists. Now, I'm having fun here. You don't want to do it, I'll do it. Now they're all scrambling and paying $200,000 for what Rob paid $5,000 for. And they should be ashamed of themselves. And why do I say this so vehemently? So they don't do it to women, so they don't do it to Latino folks, to indigenous artists. You should be able to see the quality. Our friend on Benefit Street invited me into his house to see Palmer River before he sold it to Dan. This is what I love about Rhode Island. Any story you tell,
Yep.
if it's black,
That's-
I've been on the edge of it
that's
or in the
funny.
center of it. So I go to see it, and I'm just mesmerized. He doesn't want to sell it. He's just bragging about the ownership, which is fine. And I'm not criticizing. I'm just saying how small the world is. And then Dan gets it, and Dan, and you didn't tell this part either, Dan won't sell it for cheap.
No.
Because he, for two reasons, even if Dan was here, I'd say it. One, Dan wants the money. But two, Dan loves Bannister, and Bannister needs to be escalated, elevated, and not insulted. And so he tells them what he wants. They say no. He says, you go, whatever. And then finally they come back and pay the 200 and...
Well, what actually happened, since we're putting all the cards on the table, which I was not going to do, but
You go ahead.
they turned it down when he offered it to them over my objection. A curator there, you're going to love this, Deborah Balkin, a curator there, Harry Cooper, called me on the phone, and he says, we can't buy this artist. He says, this artist sucks. That's what he said to me. And I said, I don't agree with you. And, but I knew then it was dead. Now, the big advocate there was Nancy Anderson, who is a great person. She said to me, Washington's a black city. We should have this painting. So they turn it down. So then the next thing, about 2 years later, I get a brochure from Sotheby's in the mail. And there's the Palmer River coming up at auction in 2 weeks. And the estimate on it is 60 to 80. And I call Nancy on the phone and I tell her she did not know about it. And she said, oh my God, Ed, she says, can you send me the brochure? I FedExed her the brochure. She called me back 2 days later. She says, there's a man who worked for the State Department who is retired that has just given us a lot of money. And as long as the painting passes his approval, I have enough to buy this and I can pay what Meshnig wanted. So sure enough, that happened, and that was the record. But I want to go further because there's another person here who I want to acknowledge. And once again, I'm not going to talk money. Records are meant to be broken. So what I would say, my mother was really, for her day, she was the great collector of Providence Art Club artists. But there is someone else here who I think surpassed her. And he owned the Bannister of the Hay Gatherers. His name is Nick Bruno. Nick, would you stand up? And Nick, who wants to do the right thing in life, wanted the Hay Gatherers, because 3 black women gathering hay, he wanted it to go to a major museum. And with the help of a friend of mine who is a very good dealer in New York, the Worcester Museum has acquired this painting. And they just announced it the other day. I was waiting for a couple of months for them to announce it. And so now the National Gallery has bought one, Worcester has bought one. It's a different game. And and they paid exactly. You didn't have to give it to them, and they stuck it in the basement. I mean, what I had to live with for 20 years is the 120 Bannisters that went to the Museum of African Art. They got taken over by the Smithsonian, and the person who became the director there, who is not a friend of mine, she kept those paintings in the basement for 20 years. They never saw the light of day. And when I would talk to David Driscoll on the phone, he would be moaning. He tried everything. But now she's gone. It's a different game now. There are famous people in Hollywood and in the movies that are now buying this art, and it's a different game. And there is a dealer in New York who, to his credit, is facilitating this. So that's my story.
So the other day, and then I'll give you the floor as long as you want it. The other day, not the other day, a month ago, I was a guest at that museum in New York, and curator came and took me to see the Palmer River. And I have a photo on my phone to prove it. But anyway, there it was on the main floor, in the main gallery, Mr. Bannister. And I went, no, shoulders. And a friend of mine was with me, and he says, we've been here 20 minutes. I said, it took, 125 years to get here. It's unbelievable. And I'm talking about next to Hopper, I'm talking about, unbelievable. That is what we need to have. We need every museum in this country to acknowledge Mr. Bannister, and they are, and then put him in the right place and put him on exhibit permanently. That as a permanent, he's in permanent space, never to be moved unless the building collapses. Do you hear this?
What I was going to say is I think it's, first of all, they're now being shown with great pride and with attention to detail. And thank you for your engagement with bringing attention to this work, because artists rarely have these spokespersons or advocates who are behind there. But I want to reflect back, too, that both Edward Bannister and his wife, Christiana, died in abject poverty. They had been successful to a point, quite successful, Christiana in particular, and she supported Edward Bannister's career. But towards the end of his life, things stopped to sell, and he really secluded himself some. And Christiana died about 2 years after his death. He died in 1901 in January. So there's a sadness here as well because of the lost opportunity and the challenges that they faced. And one of the things I also heard on the day we were dedicating Gage's sculpture, at nearly every lecture, that he was on the founding board of RISD. Well, he wasn't on the founding board of RISD, and we kind of expect he should have been, but he wasn't. And for a long time, I think this is representative, and I think it's a more drastic statement than one might think, because one remembers that RISD was founded in 1877 by the Woman's Centennial Committee from Rhode Island to the Philadelphia exhibition. So at the Philadelphia exhibition, where Edward Bannister won his medal, that was the same show out of which RISD was born. So when the women came back and had excess money from their exhibition and decided to form an art school, it wasn't unnoticed that Bannister was not included among the founders. Now, there weren't many artists among the founders, so it was a very small institution at that point. It didn't have a campus, and it could well be Bannister either didn't wish to be an instructor or couldn't afford to be an instructor, but he was not on the board. Alex, I don't know, is Andy here from the RISD archive? because I want to give him credit. He just found a connection to Bannister which expands this window a little bit. 7 years after RISD was founded in 1877, they held their first exhibition, which they called the First Exhibition of American Pictures, in Hoppen Homestead, where they rented their things. They showed 122 paintings. And the catalog has been around for a while. It included one painting by Bannister. But what hadn't been surfaced, that Andy just found in the last couple of weeks or months, is the letter inviting artists to be in that exhibition. And from that letter, we learned that Edward M. Bannister was one of the jurors that they had chosen to select this show. So clearly there was a more respectful relationship than we might imagine from him not being involved with RISD at all. And it could well have been that remember, he was self-taught. He might have been self-conscious about teaching others when he felt perhaps he was unschooled. He was quite thoughtful. Universally, people talked about his education, his knowledge of biblical allegory, of classical Greek themes, but he may have felt he would have rather painted.
So,
We don't know.
Barnaby, can we have our first disagreement?
Sure, go ahead. Yeah, that's why we're here.
I'm just in praise. This is a women's school, and it's not what it is today. And I don't agree. I think all colleges, they all lie. They're all full grown. Harvard is Harvard the day it started.
Right.
That's all a lie. And Brown has 7 students in his first class in one building, and lucky
Right.
to have the building. So I don't buy that. What I buy, and I've said this to Andrew, we've had a
Right.
7-year debate. You influence the creation of a place.
Sure.
And at RISD, here's an example for you. All those men, and Mr. Lippett told me this once, they weren't on the board, but the wives would come to them and talk about the deficits. And so they had a lot of influence on the school.
Sure.
And nope, we're not adding that department next year. We're spending enough. You didn't have to be on the board to make the rules for
Absolutely.
RISD.
Yeah.
Because the nature of society. And I've told Andrew a dozen times, he was on the board. I don't mean his name appeared on the whatever, but he
Right.
was friends with all those men, most of those women.
Yeah.
They were talking art. He was often in their house. And he was a teacher. He had students, several prominent students, female included.
And Mrs. Metcalf had paintings of his in her
Yes.
collection. So
I don't buy, I think this is the most unique black man. Rob calls them the Victorian power couple. I think they're the most unique black people in all of Rhode Island for all those 40 years.
Yeah.
And we see very little evidence of abuse or pushback against them.
right.
And I think he could have been on that board if he wanted to.
Yeah, that's sort of
I
what I'm
believe
saying,
it,
yeah.
and I don't think he cared or wanted to. And RISD, we're in this hall. My mother raised me when you're in people's house, pretend that everything's perfect. RISD was a nothing, and who knew it was going to ever be anything? And you have to decide what to do.
What to do? Yeah, no, we're in
And
agreement
so,
on that. Yeah.
I've been asked 20 times in the last 5 years to be on boards, and I go, eeny, meeny, miny, mo, I'm busy.
Yeah.
So I want to not agree with you. We don't have enough scholarship.
Right.
We don't know. And final comment on this, RISD needs to take a more positive attitude. He influenced the creation of this school, and that's what I've asked Andrew to say.
Right.
Black people love to call up. Was he on the, wait, they don't say was.
Yeah.
He was on the board of RISD. And Andrew says, no, he wasn't. What you see in writing is not always what
Sure, the
is.
depth of influence.
So you could be right that they didn't, but I
Well,
think they didn't because. And then finally, I didn't want to let this go. Back to Mrs. Roosevelt, one of the greatest women in the history of this country, fighting and creating Social Security. 99% of all people, black and white, died in abject poverty when they quit having their paycheck.
Right.
That's why I'm a Democrat. Oops, I'm sorry. When they quit having their paycheck, they didn't, this pre-pension, you didn't have anything other than your paycheck.
Your ingenuity and your
And
paycheck,
she had emotional, mental problems the last 2-3 years of her life, and she's the big breadwinner in that family. I don't think they ever could have lived off the money he made.
Yeah.
She bought him a yacht.
Yeah.
And so I think she goes downhill, their income goes downhill, and he dies, and that throws her over the edge. So
Yeah, I think that's probably
happens
correct.
Before Mrs. Roosevelt and Social Security, that happens in 90% of American families, that we get in trouble when the breadwinner goes.
Absolutely.
And I'm going to quit talking politics, but this relates to them. They're just regular people, and she has money, probably for 70% of her life, and then she doesn't.
Yeah.
You know, I always get a kick out of it. I'm the opposite. I'm born in abject poverty, and now I got a little money. But before Mrs. Roosevelt, that never would have happened.
The other thing, to speak of RISD, is as we announced at the opening of the program, there's a brand new Bannister in the RISD Museum collection, which is a gift of Joan Slavsky and Fred. Is Joan here? I don't know if she was going to come. Did she make it? I don't see her up there. It's... oh, okay. Thank you, Joan. This is an absolutely marvelous Bannister. It's an absolutely marvelous Bannister. I think it's an exquisite little gem of a painting. And Maureen O'Brien just hung it absolutely perfectly in the main galleries of the RISD Museum. Do go up and see it after this talk. It's on the 5th floor. You remember the big grand salon room. It's the next room just to the north of that. And it's right there with all the fellow Barbizon painters of Corot and de Bigny and the people who so influenced Bannister in his work. And right in the middle of the room is Rodin's Hand of God. And it's a stunning placement of Bannister right where he belongs. And one of the things that Ed worked on for 70 years, 60 years on this, was to try to rescue these Bannisters, find people who would care for them, restore them, and then donate them to public collections. And Joan, I'm so grateful that you gave this to the Rhode Island School of Design, because it's a great addition.
We're going to, Mrs., I have all these female heroes. May Ruther said, a conversation's never any good if the audience can't participate. So, Walter Ruther wouldn't have said that. Questions, and Alexander has the mic, and, well, I guess there'll be a mic on probably both sides. And
So if you have a question, raise your hand.
raise your hand and wait for the mic. 7 Up.
Thank you very much for that. I'm wondering whether anyone has approached any of you about making a documentary. This is such a great story.
The answer is yes. This is my chance. You ready? Probably Edgar Allan Poe, not so much, and then Lovecraft a lot more. And I don't know, Morgan, you can correct me if I'm missing anybody, but Rhode Island doesn't have somebody for the tourists to come and for the 9th graders to know. Roger Williams is in there, but he doesn't get the attention he deserves. And what you do to make somebody in the public eye is to do 10 things. Seriously, you write the book, which we haven't done yet. You do the comic book, which we haven't done yet. You know, I could tell you all 10 things. And at some point,
You install the sculpture.
you would, yes,
Sculptures.
absolutely. So that's what we're in the beginning of doing. And that has got to be in it. Now, the trouble with the real thing is minimum $300,000-$400,000 to do it right. There are a couple little videos now that are really quite good. And then we're going to have 2 from today, and we have to figure out how to get them out to schools. But what you need is the real thing. And our problem, Stages of Freedom, is each time you got to come up with the money. And you know, Gage is to be praised because the money came to him, and that sculpture's on that river, and 1 million people a year, a lot of it because of Waterfire, will see that and know who he is. And the younger people will take their little phone and So my goal, before I go to Milwaukee or heaven, is that when people come here and come in the Stages of Freedom, they'll not ask me, where is Lovecraft buried? Instead, they will ask me, where is the statue for Mr. Bannister? And I think the city, the Arts Council, tourism, Waterfire, and Stages of Freedom, the museum, the art club, the Athenaeum, we're all starting this campaign. Oh, I'm sorry, and the, pardon me, Morgan? And the Rhode Island Historical Society. You know what they say? This is Eleanor Roosevelt again. Get the list right before you start praising people.
Probably for Secretary Rickman. There are a few lost paintings by Bannister, and I'm just wondering, how do we know they're lost? Were they in like a catalog and they're not here now? Or basically, do you think that they're recoverable? Are they in somebody's living room somewhere or mislabeled? Like, I guess, how do we know, what's their status?
So I think all 3 of us will probably try to answer you. Let me go first. 1 or 2 of them are so, and actually, Ed's going to talk about Shaw. 1 or 2 of them are so good, so important, that I don't believe they're lost. I have 2 paintings in my living room of women from the 1920s that are stunning, but I haven't taken the time to research them. That's what I think about Bannister. I think they're in somebody's basement, and they haven't the right. Have you ever seen the movie where someone comes into someone's house and say, "Do you know that's a Picasso?" And the person didn't know it. That's what I think about Bannister.
If I could say something, there's one sort of curveball in this whole story that is kind of amazing. 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, you can't keep track of time, I got a call from a lady in England. Her name is Anne Louise Avery, and she said to me, "I'm coming over to Rhode Island, and I'm going to do a catalog raisonné on Bannister." And she said, and I wondered if you could pick me up at Brown, and if I could come out to your house and we could talk. So she was a very nice lady. We talked for about an hour. I didn't think she knew anything about Bannister. I came away from that meeting completely perplexed. I didn't think she knew anything. I didn't know if she was a scholar. What was she doing on an American artist? And it turns out I was wrong, because after the National Gallery bought the Palmer River, Nancy Anderson sent me a copy of what Anne Louise Avery had written about the Palmer River, and she is the real deal. She knows how to research. She is a scholar. And now, apparently about 1.5 years ago, she wasn't well. And I don't know anything more about it, although when I told her, I sent her an email that I was going to be part of this panel today, and I sent her all the images, because I'm the first one to admit, I don't know what is Jamestown, and I don't know what is Newport. You guys probably know far better than me, because I'm from Providence and Seekonk. And she never answered me. And I sent her 3 separate emails. So I'm hopeful that she is going to do something. And Nick, maybe you know more than I do.
She is going through some treatment, because oh, sorry. And I will stay in touch with her.
Good.
And, because I know she could be very helpful to some projects that are going on right now, especially with Mike. So.
Let me continue to answer those questions just for a sec. She's done, Ms. Avery's done some amazing work, and I know she has been ill, and we wish her well. And it's very important to prepare this catalog of SNA. And one of the aspects of that I've been quietly trying to explore and will continue to explore is there has long been stories that Edward Bannister chose to gift paintings to members of the black community. And in many cases, those paintings we may or may not have seen. Those families I know who have them still have them, and they are not regularly exhibited. And there are good reasons for those communities, those members of the black community, to be cautious about talking about the paintings. But we would like to put together an anonymous set of resources of conservation and valuation so that they can have an independent information about it, and with their permission perhaps get them photographed so that we can add them to the collection. One of the things from a curatorial perspective is, would the paintings that Bannister didn't put up for sale to a white clientele but chose to give to black members of the community, would they give us a different view of Bannister the man? And it would be fascinating to learn that. And we'll continue to try to explore that. And I think that's an important thing. Someone was asking about the missing paintings. I think it was Bill. Of course, the most famous painting, and I think we've got the drawing of it, is Under the Oaks, which was the painting for which he won the bronze medal in the Centennial. You sometimes hear it referred to as a first prize or a gold award. The Centennial Awards were all bronze, and they were quite deliberate in declaring them of equal value. But this was the sketch he made. I don't think it's the preparatory sketch. People call it that also. I think it's a sketch he made after the fact for inclusion in a later publication in Massachusetts. But he did sign it and attest that it was a likeness of it. This is a very large painting, 48 by 78 inches. It was purchased directly from the jury. To get into the Centennial, you had to be in the States prior exhibition and judged into that. Rhode Island did not have a prior exhibition, so Rhode Islanders participated in a Massachusetts exhibition, and this was entered in Boston and much admired, and sold before it had even gone to the Centennial. And Mitchell's condition was it had still to be entered. In the catalog for the Centennial, it's listed as owned by the artist, which is incorrect so far as we know. The painting was kept in the family. It went through a couple of generations, and then the I think it's 3 generations down, the wife of Dr. Bullard auctioned it in New York. But thereafter, it's been lost. It's a large painting that everyone commented on how magnificent it was. So I agree with Ray. I don't think it was put on the trash bin, but it is lost in the sense that we don't know where it is.
Do you know the other thing is, everything is not lost that we don't know where it's at. Seriously, I've been asking someone to ask me about a Bannister for years, and they haven't got around to asking me. I know where it's at. And then it was an art dealer that I was talking to 10 years ago, wouldn't tell me the name of a person who owned a Bannister, but showed me a picture of it because they didn't want people to know they owned a Bannister. And so I think there are a lot of things that aren't lost that are not cataloged. Try that word. Finally, on this, Mr. Cosby offered $1 million for Under the Oaks. So I've been looking for it for 20 years.
So I wanted to say how deeply grateful I am for this conversation. Is it me? Okay. How deeply grateful I am for this conversation as a still really new resident of Rhode Island, to understand this history in this way is so incredibly valuable, especially as a black woman. I'm so struck by Bannister and the subject of his paintings, which obviously this is just a drop in the bucket, but the representations of the landscapes and individuals who are non-Black. I wonder a couple things. In the art world, is this defined as Black art? We know he's a Black artist, but is this Black art? What makes art Black? I teach at Brown in Africana Studies, and we talk about the role of the Black artist and what makes art Black and what makes it, American art. So I would love to know from you all, like, how the art world defines this. Did Bannister paint these images because he felt like he couldn't paint images that represented a Black subjectivity? So I would just love to know a little bit more about that.
So Bannister probably liked nature more than people. I'm sorry, he didn't probably, he did. And you have religion in there. This is a wellness person. His soul is out there quite often. So I don't think people are on top of his hit parade. Then you do see, like, the newspaper boy, one of my favorites. And then he has early portraits that he's commissioned to do, a Black doctor and wife and the like. He's not adverse to painting Black people. He's probably adverse to painting people. When he gets around to them, he does. And then the cows in many of these paintings, the majority of them, are more important than the people. The people are this big, the cows are that big. And I think he's if I were a painter, I wouldn't be painting people. People don't interest me as much as I love dogs. I love hills, pine trees. There's an essay, I think we can get it for you. There's this fabulous essay he wrote, his only serious one, and you can see what he's thinking.
It's a lecture called "The Artist and His Critics."
Yeah. Final comment from me on this. I've been studying him for 40 years, and I don't know him yet. He didn't write enough. His friends want to talk about him in death, not in life. And I don't know why there isn't more. I'm very upset there's not more about Christiana Cato Bannister. But I think everything a Black artist, this is my Ray Rickman opinion, a Black artist's work is a Black artist's work. And these artists, Black in the last 20, 30 years doing abstract, that's Black artist's work. You don't need any people, you don't need any Black figures. That's my view.
I was originally... I think Ed's about to add to that conversation. We have a dead battery on this mic.
Go ahead. No. Mine works.
Okay. Does this work?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So, 2 or 3 things that I'd like to, and one of them is the answer. I can't explain this. This is my own DNA. When G. William Miller bought The Approaching Storm, you saw what that painting looked like. I knew that a Black person had done it, and I'm just telling you that. And also, the newspaper boy, who I bought from a white racist auctioneer who was having dinner at Christie's restaurant in Newport and made me wait till he finished eating his steak before he let me have the painting. He was positive that the newspaper boy was white and he was not of color. I knew he was. What I'm saying is art has a lot of instinctiveness to it, and also there's a spirituality to it. And as Barney said to me one day, he said, Bannister is a poetic, lyrical painter. Now that being said, the scholars that are here today, I'm sure would say that he's not George Ennis. George Inness is the great landscape painter of the last quarter of the 19th century. But, you know, George Inness's hero was Emanuel Swedenborg. And George Inness believed in Swedenborgism. And if you don't know what Swedenborgism is, Swedenborg believed that God had come down from heaven and had anointed him to change Christianity, and that Swedenborg was the only one that had the pathway to either see God or see the devil, and he was going to change Christianity. And Inness believed in this fervently. So he does some great paintings, but they're very uneven. And so I think a lot of this is subjective, and a lot of it is mystical. And I think Bannister has a little bit of Edgar Allan Poe in some of his paintings. That's just my opinion.
And I think the clue sometime in Bannister's paintings are those stormy clouds. When the city dedicated Gage's sculpture at 1 p.m. on Sunday, September 10th, I was standing there waiting for the parade, and it was a perfect Bannister cloud, just this massive, and you know, I think this is part of the symbolism of what Bannister was painting. He was talking about, you know, if you look at Joan Slowski's painting that we had up on the screen there, there's this dark valley in the distance and a stormy cloud and these menacing trees, and then there's this splash of sunlight. And you've been in those days where suddenly the sunlight is wisping through. And these are very deeply spiritual paintings. And I think the threat and the original sin of slavery, I think they're all in these paintings by Bannister, but we don't have any letters. I don't think, I mean, you'll know, or diaries from either of them. They would be wonderfully helpful to find. The Artist and His Critics is talking about the necessity for critics to help people see the spiritual meaning behind painting.
So we're going to take 3 more questions. We're going to give shorter answers.
Wait, I got the microphone here.
Go ahead.
I was originally put off by the title of this presentation because I felt that Bannister had already been saved, but I now realize that you gave us the history of how he was saved, and I appreciate that. Congratulations to all of you. With regard to missing Bannisters, I remember a few months ago on Antiques Roadshow, they had a Bannister that had been found in one of your antique stores somewhere. Whoever sold it had no idea what it was.
Newport.
And it had a rather modest value placed on it by the antiques people, but I thought that's interesting too.
How do you juxtapose a contemporary of Bannister's, George Whitaker, who was a teacher at RISD, first teacher, prolific painter. I collected him 40 years ago from him because he was cheap relative to Bannister. Couldn't find a Bannister. But I have many Whitakers that it'd be hard to place to say it's different than, it relates to a Bannister, or it's different, or I see a black theme in it, or a feeling of blackness in it. I could show you many examples. I think they're very, you'd have to really guess. And I'm waiting to see fakes of Bannister painted by Whitaker. I wouldn't be surprised.
So I have to answer real quick because this is fun for me. People take Whitaker and they take his name off and they put Bannister on. Now that Whitaker's still cheap and Bannister is arriving. My favorite phony story, I've been offered 10 Bannisters that the 2 Newport dealers told me were phony before I bought them. A postal worker in Detroit offered me a Bannister. He wanted $3,000. I said I'd have to get a really good photo and show it to the 2 dealers because I'm not so sure. And he says, it's real, and hung up on me. Call me back a week later, I'll take $1,000. And I said, a really good photo, and he hung up on me. I said, my brother lives in Detroit. He can come to your house and look at it. I don't need a photo. And he said, you send me a check for $300, and I will send it to you, and this is the end of the conversation. And sent me a photo of the back, and it's clear it's 1880, 1870, and I bought it. And it's at Stages of Freedom in the back hall. It is as phony as the day. It is you know who.
I have an interesting story to tell you. It's funny, but it isn't funny. In 1977, 78, when I was really finding the Bannisters, I got a call from a dealer that I knew not to be honest. And he said, I want to take you to a house in New Hampshire. There's a lot of paintings there, and I'm not going to tell you why I'm taking you there until we get there. So I go, this was a person who lived in this area. So he took me in his van way up to New Hampshire, and we went in a house, and it was the whole George Whitaker estate. I saw 100 Whitakers, and of course this guy was a crook. He said to me, what do you think of the idea of we could cut off part of them and we could resign them? And I, at first I told him right away, I'm not going to do that. I've never done that. I never would do that. But to answer your question, Stanley, when you saw 100 of them, like I did that day, there is a difference.
How do you fake the frame now once you put it down? Oh, you don't fake the frame.
Well, you take it out of the frame, and also there are people that.
At that point, I wouldn't touch it.
Yeah, no, but I think in all fairness, this is just my opinion, but I've been in this for 52 years. Bannister is a better painter.
Well, Whitaker gets a bum rap. I got to tell you, it's true.
Well,
both prolific, and they're both closed-off painters. That's what you see. Gentlemen, take it outside. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I have a question, and it's about, in a way, it's about putting Bannister and some of the other artists, African-American artists whose work we know. I saw a show, an astonishing show at the de Young Museum about 4 years ago from a foundation who's been collecting backcountry African-American artists. And there was an interview with an 80-year-old man, and he was terrified when they came to his door because there were laws in the South that forbid African-American artists to practice any kind of art making. And if someone came by and found that they had any art supplies to make art with, they were put in jail. Do you know anything about this? I was just breathless.
I don't
when
think
I
this
read
is
it.
true. You're talking about outsider artists?
Well, they're outsider artists because they were living in the backcountry and they weren't officially allowed.
But it might have
by
also
law.
been their style. I've never heard of such a thing, and there are hundreds of outsider black artists, and a dozen of them have risen to fame,
Right.
and 200 of them haven't. So I don't think anybody really stopped them from doing that. I've never heard of it. Now, my mother raised me. You've never heard of many things, Ray.
I'm going to find the name of the foundation for you because it's quite a large foundation, and I think it's pretty legitimate. The show was astonishing.
Will you pass that next door?
Sure.
Okay, we have time for one last fabulous question. Yes. Hi. Oh, hi.
Hi. Actually, Ray, I've been working on Christiana Bannister almost as long as you.
Yeah.
I was delighted that Barnaby said that he was Canadian. And on this little leaflet we've all been given, it keeps talking about him as an African-American artist. Can we do something about that?
Yes. We know better. I'm going to leave it alone, but we know better. It's a
But it says 4 times on here.
I understand. Rob will talk to you afterwards. And you're wonderful. We're going to have a last question, and then we're going to have a quick statement, and a short quick statement. Someone else? Last question? Good. Bad. So, Barnaby, say an excellent comment.
Well, thank you all for being here. This is part of the discovery of Bannister that I think he was seen with new eyes in 1879 when he won this medal, the only Rhode Island artist so recognized. And I think the community, that helped for him to be embraced. But if you look at the records of the Providence Art Club and the A&E Club, or the AE Club, excuse me, which he also helped to found, he was much beloved in his community and was spoken of with a grace and a respect. And there's a photograph that Nancy Grinnell had found of him on his boat, the Fanchon, which I shared with you guys the other day. I want to talk to Nancy to try. Is Nancy here? She might have come today. I wanted to try to get 2 generations back to look at the original. I read it that he's got a broad grin in this photograph, and you don't see that very often. And I think he was, at that period in his life, this was probably about 1885, so 15 years before he died. I think he was in a place here where the community actually had earned the respect of the community. I'm sure it was a difficult life. We have much we need to continue with that. I'm delighted that Joan Slofsky's Bannister is so beautifully hung upstairs. Please go take a look at it. I think Maureen did a great job with that. And that we need to be all part of this progress, not just for Bannister, but for all sorts of artists who are not properly recognized.
Rabbi, were you trying to say something earlier? I thought I saw, but I didn't.
I just would like to thank Ray and Barney for inviting me to do this. I never thought anything like this would happen, and I had everything so disciplined in terms of what I was going to say today, but it was so emotional for me that it came out so differently, and it was cathartic. So thank you. And I also want to express my admiration for the Nick Brunos and the Dan Meshnigs of the world who stay the course and play the end game. Because if you do in life, good things happen. And I doubt that Bannister is watching this. I hope but if he is, he's smiling.
So I have one other thank you we want to make. We had very much wanted to share with you an absolutely magnificent Bannister that is very, very rarely seen. And it's owned by the Jamestown Historical Society, who very generously offered for us to present it for you to see. At the last minute, we had a complication with the insurance coverage, so that, regretfully, we could not include that. I believe we have a slide of it. Let's put up the slide of it. So this is Jamestown Harbor at sunset. I've never seen it in person. I've only known it in reproduction. But I believe some members of the Jamestown Historical Society are here. And I really want to thank you. We were so sorry that the paperwork we had wasn't quite what we had needed. But Diana Rue and Rosemary Enright, thank you so much for helping to do that. And then Wendy McGraw of Art Pack had volunteered to bring it up safely back and forth, and I think Wendy may be here. I don't see her. But I want to thank you very much, and I do hope when you do put it on exhibition again, we would make sure that we will get people down to your exhibition, because it's a very large painting. Well, for Bannister, it's a very large painting. It's not the dark, lowering skies we've seen. This was a gift that was given to the Jamestown Historical Society, 20 years ago, 30 years ago? And very few people have seen it. And Ed particularly was hoping we could have it here, and I want to apologize that we couldn't quite figure out how to get the insurance to work. So you were willing to lend it, and that was very gracious of you.
So You know what, just what you just said. You know, there are people who stay the course and the people who join the course. And Mike McGuigan has created this fabulous document. I'm waiting for the novel, but until the novel comes, I want to thank you. I have gone, stand up, Michael. So I have gone through, I'm your biggest fan. I've read this 3 times. I have a copy at home that's a mess. And I use it to learn. And I use it to remember. We were just talking about, I want to remind everybody what an intelligent, educated as a child, and what an intelligent, educated man Edward Mitchell Bannister was in that era where virtually nobody, in that era in which virtually nobody black gets to go to school. And he gets to go in Canada and the like. Yay, Canada. I'm an ex-Detroiter hanging out in Canada all the time. Yay, Canada. And anyone wants a copy, we have 30 left. You can come over to Stages of Freedom and get it, but
It's bannister.info is the web address, and it's amazing how deep it is, how
unbelievable it is in terms of, you go through the newspaper clippings. I want to say this final thing, because I never go to a party without suggesting that someone do something. I was just telling Deb that the Bannisters are mentioned by William Lloyd Garrison. He was friends with them, real friends, in which he tells Helen, his wife, who lived 3 blocks from here, Benson. Did you know that? So he writes to her saying, I want you to buy some product. It may not be good, it may not be quite what you need, but we need to support Christiana Cato Bannister by buying some product. Now, I think he means white women can't use this stuff. I don't know what he means, because we've never found the bottle and we don't have the recipe. But anyway, I'm saying to myself, did they ever stay in William Lloyd Garrison's house? They rented from 3 black abolitionists who were all super friends of his, of whom Frederick Douglass stayed in all their houses. She's Frederick Douglass's friend. He's lesser Frederick Douglass' friend. Oh, the circle is so enriching. And I think over these last 30-some years that I know stuff. Every time I go through here, I see something else. You're a saintly person for doing this, and I urge everybody, I really mean this. Rob and I do this all day long. I urge everybody to take up something and do it. And you don't have, and if you're not a scholar, you don't need to be. If you're just a thinker, that's enough. And we just hired somebody to find, this is my last comment, except the other one I'm going to make. We hired someone to find descendants. We've given up, of course, because Edward Bannister has no descendants, no children, and then a brother, William, whose son dies early. That's the end of the Bannisters. And the brain doesn't work. Since Edward Bannister's family is gone, you say, oh, they're gone. And then about 6 months ago, I say, she has nieces and nephews, Ray. And I get to work, but I'm too busy. So we actually find some money, and we hire a researcher. She's found 7 descendants. And not for a lot of money. I urge you, we're going to make the Bannisters the center of the cultural history of this community, with your help. Seriously. Thank you.
So that Jane doesn't have to find me afterwards, I take a more global look at North America, but I think your point is well taken. Again, I want to thank the RISD Museum for hosting us. We had over 200 people register for this event, and obviously not all of them can make it, but clearly the interest is there. This video will be made available as soon as it's made available to us. We will post it. And in your program are the 2 links that you can continue to do your research on Bannister. So, Ed Shein, thank you for saving Bannister.